and thank you all for joining us. My name is Vatsala Kumar, and I'm one of the co-presidents of the University of Chicago ACS chapter this year. It is my great honor to introduce Tahir Duckett, our keynote speaker this evening. Tahir studied political science and religion at Emory University before spending a decade working as an organizer in the labor movement, including directing the Young Worker Program at the AFL-CIO and helping to mobilize millions of workers. He attended Georgetown for law school, where he graduated magna cum laude as a public interest law scholar. After law school, Tahir clerked for the Honorable George J. Hazel on the United States District Court for the District of Maryland, and he worked at Public Citizen as a Supreme Court Assistance Project Fellow. He's a founding executive committee member of Law for Black Lives DC, an organization providing legal and policy support to the movement for Black lives in the DC area. He is also the founder and executive director of Rethink, a DC-based organization dedicated to preventing sexual violence by working with young men and boys to break down the cultural norms that underpin sexual violence. Tahir is currently an attorney at Relman Colfax, where he focuses on racial justice in civil rights litigation matters. He works on a variety of cases, including ones involving discrimination in housing, employment, education, and policing. He's currently part of the team challenging Fannie Mae's discriminatory maintenance of real estate-owned properties, as well as the team representing children poisoned by drinking contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Tahir.
Thank you so much, Vatsala. And thank you to everyone at ACS for putting this together. This is a truly bizarre time to have to learn on the fly how to put together a remote convention like this. And I hope you are all so very proud of what you've managed to build. I want to start today by talking about Gerald Lopez. In 1992, Gerald Lopez published a book called Rebellious Lawyering, One Chicano's Vision of Progressive Law Practice. And in it, he talked about lawyers who worked with low-income immigrant communities, people who often thought of themselves as heroes, people who practice law with the best of intentions, and sometimes who won important victories for their clients. The kinds of lawyers who are often romanticized in the narratives that we tell about ourselves, the narratives that we tell each other, the narratives that other people tell about us that we love to uplift. But what Lopez did was he stripped some of that romance away, explaining how these lawyers often treated their clients like children, not allowing them to participate in the development of their cases, sometimes winning short-term victories that imposed long-term costs. And as I speak before this group of talented, ambitious young lawyers in training, I can't help but think of all the ways that this profession, starting in law school, but by no means ending there, it is so carefully designed to warp and even replace your view of the world. You can start with the elitism, T25, T18, T10. There's this absurd insistence on determining our value as potential lawyers based on what US News and World Report says. And can you just take a moment to consider the absurdity? I'd wager not a single person listening relies on US News and World Report for literally any other news. And yet our echo chamber has us assigning value based on it. And if that weren't enough hierarchy, we add other elite markers like GPAs and clerkships and law review and moot court and all these other ways of trying to easily sort ourselves into tiers of value. And look, there is nothing wrong with doing any of these things. You may find some of them valuable. I really enjoyed my clerkship, though not everyone I know did. But not a single one of these elite markers will or should define you in your career. And most important, you shouldn't let any of these gold stars determine to whom you assign value, determine who is worth listening to. Who do you listen to? Who are your people? Who are you accountable to? The answers to these questions will say far more about who you are and what value you're bringing into the world than how many legal gold stars you collect. Who do you listen to? Who are your people? Who are you accountable to? If you're not careful, this profession will have you answering that question based on wealth, power, education, reputation, influence, who can help you move from point A to point B in your career path. It will have you thinking that the education or billable value of a client is a reflection of their worth. It will have you deciding who's a serious person based on what institution they represent or what judge they worked with. It will have you mistaking all of these markers for merit and mistaking merit for value and importance. But all of these markers still privilege for entry just a tiny fraction of what this nation has to offer. White men are 30% of the population, but they make up 58% of state court judges. A 2017 study found that 82.5% of federal law clerks were white, only 5% were Black, and only 4% were Hispanic. And that's without taking into account the additional complicating factor of the input of family wealth, of geography, of class, of immigration status, of disability. All this means that the more that you progress, the more successful you become, the more you become surrounded by voices that come from singular perspectives. This is true in law school, it's true in private practice, it's true in public interest law, and that's why it's so important to have an anchor. Who do you listen to? Who are your people? Who are you accountable to? You see, Gerald Lopez noticed that even public interest lawyers weren't building their practice around the voices that they claimed to represent. These were smart people, but well-intentioned smart lawyers have led us down several dark roads because you're no stronger than the breadth of perspectives that you can carry. I've sat in rooms full of very, very smart lawyers with all the elite markers that you could ask for. T14 this, clerkship that, and I've watched them brainstorm, debate, and make decisions without an ounce of input from the people who would be most affected by those decisions. Now, this profession teaches you that by account of our degrees and our bar cards and especially our elite markers, that the only people that you need to listen to are already in the room, and that that's a sustainable way to lawyer. I'm here to tell you that it is not. You just can't see enough on your own. Even if it weren't the case that this profession works so hard to narrow your field of vision. I know that that's something that all of you have already experienced just in law school. And the bad news that I have for you is that that doesn't let up. You need perspectives outside of your own. And you need perspectives from the people who are hurting the most if you want to be sure that you're not contributing to that hurt. Smart people with all the intellectual resources in the world have failed us time and time again by evaluating the world through a peephole, and we've suffered for it. Smart liberals told us in 2017 that the next 4 years wouldn't be so bad. Smart people said that the city of Flint would benefit from emergency management. Smart people thought that if we gave police officers body-worn cameras, that they'd kill fewer Black people. I'm not just pointing fingers here. I've been one of those smart people, which I hope is enough to say that token diversity isn't enough to do the trick. But I remember myself thinking in 2015, after the death of Michael Brown, that if Darren Wilson just had his body camera on, maybe he wouldn't have done this. You know, maybe we could have prevented all this unrest. Maybe we'd feel like we had more certainty about what happened. But also, I knew enough to know that by this time I was no longer living in a neighborhood that was heavily policed. And I knew enough to know that I needed to listen to the people who actually lived in those neighborhoods before I went out into the world preaching the gospel of body cameras. And so I spent time with those people and developed real and genuine relationships with them. And I listened to them. And the words they told me were prophetic, right? They said, look, body cameras will only be used to incarcerate more Black people. They won't put a dent in the violence and harassment that we're experiencing on an everyday basis. And by the way, that's proved to be true. Body cameras were rolling as Derek Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck, as Aurora police officers killed Elijah McClain, as Louisville police officers killed Breonna Taylor. And I say all of this to you because our nation needs so very much of you at this moment. We face both immense promise and enormous peril. The minoritarian structures in our government, the unprecedented concentrations of wealth, yet to be resolved problems of how to incorporate big technology into our democracy, all of these are conspiring to push us to a breaking point. And yet, we have more opportunities than ever before to truly listen to those that our political system has rendered invisible for decades, for longer than decades. Ours is a system that has thrived on the backs of these people that we've made purposefully invisible. I'm talking about the Black neighborhoods where the police act like an occupying force, but maybe you've never experienced that kind of state violence because those neighborhoods are so segregated from your own. I'm talking about the millions of people who are incarcerated every year in truly horrifying conditions, who we've disposed of in cages after we refused to meet their needs before they came into contact with the criminal system. I'm talking about the trans folk whose very existence seems up for debate in the elite media that refuses to report on the truly breathtaking rates of violence that they face. I'm talking about the Asians, the Asian Americans, the Pacific Islanders who are portrayed as model minorities in one moment, only to be victimized by xenophobic language and violence the next. I'm talking about the 1 billion with a B, global climate refugees who will lose everything because we've spent 150 years burning coal. Immigrants, the unhoused, all of these communities are screaming, trying to tell us what this nation needs to do in order for us to start being worthy of the aspirational values of our founding. My question for you is, are you listening to them? Do you know how to listen to them? This generation of lawyers, we're not the heroes of this story. The heroes are those who have survived the most oppressive conditions this nation has to offer and who have demanded that we do better. But we can be the facilitators if we listen. Who are you listening to? Who are your people? Who are you accountable to? You cannot do the things that we need you to do if you're not doing that hard work. The work of building real, genuine relationships and connections in these communities. The work of listening to them. And most importantly, the work of being accountable to them. And let me be clear, because I know in legal circles, this next statement is a controversial one. What you do matters. The world that all of us have been living in is not working. January 6th, climate disaster, white supremacy and white nationalism reinvigorated not just in the United States, but across Europe. That's the fruit of our current approach. One in which, in part at least, we pretend like lawyers can simply be neutrals, for us to pretend like the law is just in and of itself some higher calling that sanitizes whatever we choose to do with it. But the law's been there all along as we spiral towards mass incarceration, record wildfires every year. We have to start questioning much more fundamentally what it is that we are doing and not doing. It's not a neutral choice to defend corporations from being sued by child slaves. It's not a neutral choice to charge 100 people with crimes in state court, and almost all of them are Black. It's not a neutral choice to charge journalists with a crime for covering protests against police violence. What you do and how you do it, these things matter. Frederick Douglass said back in 1857, just a few years prior to the start of the Civil War, that those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Today, I say to you that he might as well have been talking about attorneys who profess to favor freedom and yet will do no more than hope for it. Douglass went on, you might have heard this one before, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. If you squint, you can just catch a glimpse of it on the horizon. A truly pluralistic society, a democracy that makes the most of all the wealth that this nation has accumulated. One that knows it can do better than it has done, that it can be better than it has been. I won't pretend that there isn't a lot standing in our way, but if we root ourselves in the communities who have the most to gain from liberation, if we can help make their work easier, if we can help them to endure long enough to prescribe the tyrannies that we face, this is what it means to be a movement lawyer. I hope that you'll join me. Thanks, and if we have time for a couple of questions, I am happy to take them.
Yes, hi. I think we do have time for a couple of questions. The first question is, what are some key areas of housing discrimination litigation that you think are on the main front of attacking to correct disparities?
So that's a good question. When I first came to Relman Colfax as a summer associate several years ago, I wasn't all that interested in housing discrimination. It was right in the midst of the uprisings that were happening nationwide, and we were all talking about police violence. And it seemed to me like that was where the action was, and that's what I was going to be most interested in. What I didn't realize was just how much housing discrimination not only prevented people from living in the places that they needed to, that they wanted to live, but also how much it stole in terms of the generational wealth that, the generational wealth that Black and Brown communities have never really had the opportunity to build in the United States. I think that when it comes to working on housing discrimination, some of the reverse redlining work that we're doing at Relman Colfax, I think is really, really, really critical work, where we can find banks, find giant corporations who essentially lure Black and Brown communities into really predatory loans, the consequences of which may be that they lose all of the generational wealth that they have been building, year by year over the last few decades. And so I think that work is really important and is really cutting edge. I think that it's something that needs to be expanded.
Okay, I think we're about out of time. Thank you so much, Tahir. That was a really beautiful and moving talk. Thank you everyone for joining us today. For those who have signed up for networking dinners, those should start shortly.
Thanks, everyone.